In 1900, at the dawn of the 20th century, Harlem and the Bronx were both on the edge of something enormous. Both were outer territories, being swallowed by an expanding New York City. Both were home to waves of immigrants chasing something better. Both were filled with new apartment buildings, new streets, new ambition, and in almost every measurable way, they were the same. One of them became the cultural capital of Black America. The other became a symbol of everything that can go wrong in a city. This is the story of how two neighborhoods that shared the same starting line ended up a world apart, and why the forces that divided them have almost nothing to do with the people who lived there. To understand how different Harlem and the Bronx became, you have to understand how similar they were to begin with. In the late 1800s, both neighborhoods were being built at the same time, for the same reasons, by the same kinds of people. New York City was exploding. Between 1880 and 1910, the population of the city more than doubled. Immigrants were arriving by the millions from Italy, from Eastern Europe, from Russia, from the Caribbean. The old tenements of the Lower East Side were beyond capacity, and the city needed somewhere new to put everyone. The answer was, go north. Harlem was the first to fill up. Sitting at the top of Manhattan, it had been farmland and country estates for most of the 19th century, but when the elevated railroad arrived in 1878, connecting Harlem to downtown Manhattan in under 30 minutes, everything changed. Developers flooded in. Elegant brownstones went up. Row houses lined every block. By the 1890s, Harlem was one of the most desirable middle-class addresses in New York City. Stanford White, one of the most celebrated architects in America, was designing buildings there, and the families moving in were white, upwardly mobile, and deeply convinced that Harlem was the future. The Bronx was going through the same transformation, only slightly later. Annexed by New York City in 1898, the Bronx was the only borough attached to the mainland of the United States, a geographic fact that would later matter enormously. Through the first 2 decades of the 20th century, it developed rapidly. The elevated trains arrived. Apartment buildings rose. The Grand Concourse, a wide tree-lined boulevard modeled after the Champs-Élysées in Paris, was built to give the Bronx its own sense of grandeur. By the 1920s, the Bronx was home to nearly 1 million people, most of them Jewish and Italian immigrants who had made it out of the cramped tenements of Manhattan and into something that felt, for the first time, like real stability. Both neighborhoods were places of arrival, places where people landed when they were moving up. Both were dense and proud and working class and full of possibility. The difference was invisible in 1900. It would not stay invisible for long. The story of how Harlem became Black Harlem is one of the most extraordinary stories in American history, and it begins not in New York, but in the American South. Between 1910 and 1970, approximately 6 million Black Americans left the South in what historians call the Great Migration. They were leaving Jim Crow laws, sharecropping, lynchings, and a system of racial oppression so total it touched every aspect of daily life. They were moving to the industrial cities of the North, Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, and above all, New York, and they needed somewhere to live when they got there. In Harlem, they found it. The man most responsible for making that possible was a real estate agent named Philip Payton, Jr. Payton had come to New York City in 1899 from Westfield, Massachusetts. He'd worked as a barber, a handyman, a janitor in a real estate office, scraping together enough experience to go out on his own. He advertised himself with a single line: "Colored man makes a specialty of managing colored tenements." His first real break came from a dispute between 2 white landlords on West 134th Street. One of them, furious at his rival, handed his building to Payton to manage, purely out of spite. Payton filled it with black tenants, made it work, and used that success to persuade other landlords to do the same. By 1904, he'd formalized the operation. On June 15th of that year, Payton chartered the Afro-American Realty Company, issuing 50,000 shares at $10 each, and he appealed to black investors with a prospectus that read, The very prejudice that has heretofore worked against us can be turned and used to our profit. What happened next? The New York Times called a real estate race war. The Hudson Realty Company, a white-owned firm, bought 3 tenement buildings from Payton's company on West 135th Street, immediately evicted all the black tenants, and replaced them with white ones. Payton's response was swift and precise. He purchased 2 adjacent apartment houses, evicted their white tenants, and moved the displaced black residents back in. Hudson eventually gave up and sold the original 3 buildings back at a loss. Block by block. That's how Black Harlem was built. By 1920, Harlem was transforming into the largest black urban community in America. And then something happened that nobody predicted. The concentration of so many talented, educated, ambitious black Americans in one place, freed from the worst of Southern oppression and living in close proximity to each other for the first time in American history, produced an explosion of creativity that would reshape the entire culture of the 20th century. The Harlem Renaissance wasn't a movement that was planned. It simply erupted. Langston Hughes arrived. Zora Neale Hurston, County Cullen, Duke Ellington took up residence on Sugar Hill. Louis Armstrong played the clubs along 133rd Street. The Cotton Club, the Savoy Ballroom, Small's Paradise, these weren't just nightclubs. They were laboratories where jazz was being invented in real time. And Harlem in the 1920s wasn't only about art, it was about power. Marcus Garvey, the Jamaican-born activist who founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA, had made Harlem the headquarters of the largest black mass movement in American history, a movement that at its peak claimed millions of members worldwide and preached black economic self-determination with an urgency the mainstream world found deeply threatening. On 125th Street, A. Philip Randolph was organizing the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the first major labor union led by black Americans, building the kind of institutional power that would lay the groundwork for the civil rights movement decades later. These weren't peripheral figures. They were central to what Harlem was becoming. The writers and poets of Harlem were doing something just as radical as the musicians. They were insisting, at a time when mainstream American culture refused to acknowledge black humanity, that black life was rich and complex and beautiful and worthy of literature. Langston Hughes wrote poems about the streets of Harlem the same way Walt Whitman had written poems about America, with total conviction that this was a subject worthy of art. Harlem in the 1920s wasn't a neighborhood. It was a statement. And while all of that was happening in Upper Manhattan, the Bronx was doing something entirely different. It was becoming the most stable, comfortable, middle-class neighborhood in New York City. In the 1920s and 30s, while Harlem was being transformed by the Great Migration, the Bronx was entering what many of its former residents would later call the Golden Age. The Grand Concourse was at its peak. The wide boulevard that ran the length of the Western Bronx was lined with Art Deco apartment buildings, elegant and well-constructed, with lobbies decorated in terrazzo floors and ornamental ironwork. The families who lived there were mostly Jewish, first- and second-generation immigrants from Eastern Europe who had made it out of the Lower East Side and into something that felt genuinely solid. These weren't rich people. They were school teachers and garment workers and small business owners. But they had made it to the Bronx, and to them, that meant something real. It meant stability. It meant safety. It meant a bedroom for each child and a lobby with a uniformed doorman and a park nearby where you could take a walk on Saturday afternoon without feeling like the city was pressing in on all sides. Yankee Stadium opened in the Bronx in 1923, the house that Ruth built, the greatest stadium in baseball, a monument to the borough's arrival. The Bronx Zoo was there, the New York Botanical Garden. The borough felt complete. Through the Depression and through the Second World War, the Bronx held together. People were struggling everywhere, but the community was tight enough to weather it. The neighborhood associations were strong. The synagogues and the churches kept people anchored. The fabric didn't tear. In 1940, The Bronx was one of the most densely populated places in America, and one of the most stable. What happened to it over the next 30 years is almost impossible to comprehend unless you understand the man who did it. Robert Moses never won a single election. He never held elected office. But for 4 decades, from roughly 1930 to 1970, he had more power over the shape of New York City than any mayor, any governor, or any other individual in the city's history. Moses built things. He built highways, parks, bridges, housing projects, beaches, and tunnels. He built the Triborough Bridge and Jones Beach and the Belt Parkway and the Gowanus Expressway and the Henry Hudson Parkway. He reshaped the entire metropolitan region according to his vision of what a modern city should look like, and his vision centered on the automobile and on a deep and well-documented contempt for the poor, the non-white, and the urban. What Moses did to the Bronx is now studied as one of the defining examples of urban renewal, a term that sounded like progress and functioned like demolition. In the early 1950s, Moses decided that the Bronx needed a highway, a Cross Bronx Expressway that would carry traffic from the George Washington Bridge in the west all the way to the Throgs Neck Bridge in the east. Construction had already begun in 1948. The highway would cut straight through the heart of the borough. There were 2 possible routes. The residents of East Tremont, a dense working-class neighborhood directly in the path, could see the alternative themselves: shift the route 2 blocks south, along the edge of Crotona Park. That change would spare 150 buildings housing 1,530 apartments. It would demolish only 6 dilapidated brownstones housing 19 families, plus an old bus depot. It would save the city and state millions of dollars in relocation and demolition costs. A local woman named Lillian Edelstein organized her neighbors into the East Tremont Neighborhood Association. They hired one of Moses's own engineers to draw up the alternate plan. They got support from their congressman, from city officials, from the borough president. At the first Board of Estimate hearing, Moses's plans were actually denied, partly because 100 East Tremont housewives showed up and made clear they weren't moving. Moses responded, not with argument, but with leverage. He threatened to abandon the half-built project entirely, knowing that no city official would let him walk away after hundreds of millions of dollars had already been spent. He controlled enough contracts and enough money flowing through enough agencies that the elected officials who had supported Edelstein reversed their positions one by one. Lillian Edelstein lost. Robert Caro, who would later win the Pulitzer Prize for his biography of Moses, called the chapter about that single mile of highway the most moving thing in all his research. In East Tremont, as the buildings were condemned and services were cut off, Edelstein told Caro, as soon as the top floor of a building was empty, they'd start tearing the roof and the top stories even. The Cross Bronx Expressway was completed in 1963. In the 5 years of construction through East Tremont alone, 5,000 residents were displaced. Across the full construction period, from 1948 to 1972, tens of thousands more were forced out as property values collapsed and the neighborhood fabric unraveled around the 7-mile gash that had been cut through the middle of the borough. The families who could leave, left. Many went to Co-op City, a massive new development in the northeast Bronx built partly to absorb the displaced, and when they went, they took with them the social networks, the community organizations, the small businesses, everything that had held the neighborhood together. The buildings they left behind didn't find new stable tenants. They found landlords who had no intention of maintaining them. What happened to the South Bronx in the 1970s is one of the most catastrophic urban disasters in American history, and it's still not fully understood by most people who weren't there. The chain of events went something like this. After the Cross Bronx Expressway displaced working-class families and collapsed property values, the neighborhood demographics shifted rapidly. The families who could afford to leave left. Those who couldn't, primarily poor Black and Puerto Rican families who had been moving into the Bronx since the 1950s, remained. Landlords, seeing their property values collapse while maintenance costs stayed fixed, made a calculation. Many stopped maintaining their buildings entirely. They collected rent from desperate tenants who had nowhere else to go, let the buildings deteriorate, and then, when the buildings became truly uninhabitable, many of them did something almost unthinkable. They burned them down. But before the arson came another policy, quieter and more bureaucratic, and in some ways more damning. In the mid-1970s, a New York City planning commissioner named Roger Starr advanced a proposal he called planned shrinkage. The idea was explicit. The city should deliberately withdraw services, fire stations, garbage collection, schools, from neighborhoods deemed too far gone to save, in order to accelerate depopulation and eventually redevelop the land. Planned shrinkage was never formally adopted, but the evidence suggests it was informally practiced. Fire stations in the South Bronx were closed or reduced in exactly the years when arson fires were multiplying. The policy put a bureaucratic imprimatur on abandonment and called it strategy. A 2025 book by historian Bench Ansfield, titled Born in Flames and published by W. W. Norton, spent a decade reconstructing exactly what happened. The most destructive fires in the South Bronx, Ansfield demonstrates, weren't set by residents. They were set by landlords. Landlords who had bought up buildings for as little as $2,500 and insured them for as much as $500,000. Landlords who hired arsonists, mostly young black and brown men from the very neighborhoods being destroyed, to torch their own properties so they could collect the insurance and walk away. The fraud reached across the world. Federal investigators uncovered one circuit of capital that ran from a local Bronx insurance broker writing substandard policies for criminal landlords, to a fly-by-night underwriter in Florida, to a rogue Lloyd's of London syndicate, all the way to a reinsurance firm in Brazil. It wasn't disorganized desperation. It was a financial system, operating at global scale, extracting profit from the destruction of black and brown neighborhoods. Scholars have since named the mechanism behind it: fire, finance, insurance, and real estate, an interlocking set of industries whose interests aligned, disastrously, around the extraction of value from communities that had no political power to resist. Between 1970 and 1981, the Bronx lost 1 in every 5 housing units to abandonment and arson. That's more than 100,000 units, gone. The most affected neighborhoods lost up to 80% of their housing stock. By the mid-1970s, entire blocks of the South Bronx looked like photographs of bombed-out European cities after the Second World War. Buildings stood roofless and gutted. Rubble lots stretched for acres. The population of the South Bronx had dropped by half. In 1977, during Game 2 of the World Series broadcast from Yankee Stadium, the New York Yankees against the Los Angeles Dodgers, on ABC, television cameras captured footage of a building on fire just blocks from the stadium. Sportscasters Howard Cosell and Keith Jackson, calling the game for a national audience of millions, referenced the blaze on air. The exact phrase most people remember, "Ladies and gentlemen, the Bronx is burning," was almost certainly never said in exactly that form, but the image was broadcast to the entire country. A World Series, the nation's game, and just beyond the stadium walls, an American neighborhood was on fire. That image became shorthand for the complete collapse of an American community, and unlike most shorthand, it pointed at something real. What it obscured was the cause. The people living in the South Bronx during this period weren't the cause of the destruction. They were its victims. They'd been delivered a neighborhood systematically stripped of its stability by a highway, by absentee landlords, by insurance fraud, by planned shrinkage, and by a city government that had decided the South Bronx was expendable. For most of the 1970s, tenant vandalism and welfare fraud stood as the prevailing public explanation for the fires. The landlords walked away clean, and yet something emerged from the rubble that nobody expected. On the evening of August 11th, 1973, a 90-degree Saturday in the Bronx with 2 suspicious fires already burning somewhere in the borough, a young woman named Cindy Campbell threw a back-to-school party in the recreation room of the apartment building at 1520 Sedgwick Avenue in the West Bronx. She needed to raise money for school clothes. She charged 50 cents for boys and 25 cents for girls, and she asked her 18-year-old brother to DJ. His name was Clive Campbell. The neighborhood knew him as Cool Herc. What Cool Herc did that night had never been done before. He isolated the percussion break, the few seconds in a funk or soul record when the singing stopped and the rhythm section carried everything alone, and by switching back and forth between two copies of the same record on two turntables, he extended that break indefinitely. He called it the merry-go-round technique. The dancers on the floor who waited for those moments became B-boys and B-girls. A party flyer from that night, recovered in the Harvard archive, confirms the date, the address, the time, 9 in the evening to 4 in the morning. It is, as one music historian put it, hip-hop's birth certificate. From 1520 Sedgwick Avenue, in a neighborhood that had been written off by the entire city, a new culture was born. Cool Herc, Grandmaster Flash, Africa Bambaataa, the Sugar Hill Gang. These weren't people who had resources or institutions or the blessing of mainstream culture behind them. They were people who had nothing except each other and a sound system and an almost incomprehensible amount of creative energy. The parallel to the Harlem Renaissance isn't accidental, and it isn't comfortable. Both movements emerged from communities under extreme duress. Both were the product of people who had been pushed into a corner by forces they didn't control, and who responded by creating something the world had never seen before. But here's where the story gets harder. While the Bronx was burning in the 1970s, Harlem was going through its own crisis. Quieter, slower, and ultimately more reversible. The Harlem Renaissance hadn't lasted. The Great Depression ended the party. White patrons stopped coming uptown. Record labels stopped recording black artists in Harlem. The Cotton Club closed. The money left. The neighborhood that had been, for one extraordinary decade, the cultural center of the African American world, found itself broke and neglected by the city that surrounded it. Through the 1940s and 50s, Harlem became increasingly poor. Housing stock that had once been the pride of Manhattan's middle class began to deteriorate under the pressure of overcrowding and landlord neglect, the same pattern playing out in the Bronx, just at a slower speed and in a smaller geography. By the 1970s, Harlem was in crisis. Drug addiction, poverty, crime, crumbling infrastructure. The neighborhood that had given the world Langston Hughes and Duke Ellington was now characterized primarily, in the white imagination, by danger. And then, very slowly, something began to shift. The shift started in the 1980s and accelerated dramatically through the 90s. Crime rates fell sharply across New York City, the result of a combination of economic changes, aggressive policing, and federal drug enforcement. As crime fell, neighborhoods that had been considered uninvestable suddenly looked different to developers. Harlem was prime real estate sitting in the middle of the most expensive city in America. It was on Manhattan. It had architecture, those brownstones and row houses built during the boom of the 1890s, still standing and structurally sound beneath decades of deferred maintenance. It had subway access on every side, and it had cultural cachet that no amount of money could manufacture. So the money came. First came community development corporations, funded partly by federal programs and partly by local nonprofits, renovating buildings that had been abandoned for decades. Then came small businesses. Then came the chains. When a Starbucks opened on 125th Street in the late 90s, longtime residents treated it as both a sign of progress and a warning. That warning turned out to be correct. Gentrification didn't save Black Harlem. It transformed it. The families who had lived through the hard years, who had raised children in Harlem when Harlem wasn't fashionable, who had maintained community organizations and churches and block associations through poverty and neglect, found themselves priced out of the neighborhood their resilience had kept alive. The brownstones on 120th Street that had sold for almost nothing in 1985 were listing for $2 and $3 million by the 2010s. The restaurants and galleries and coffee shops that followed the money made Harlem, in many ways, beautiful again. But the people who had been there through the lean years were largely gone. The Bronx in the 21st century presents a more complicated picture, and in some ways, a more honest one. The gentrification that transformed Harlem moved fast precisely because Harlem is on Manhattan, the most desirable island in the most desirable city in America. Once the decision was made to invest in Harlem, the money arrived in a flood. The Bronx isn't Manhattan, it's the mainland. And so, while parts of the borough have seen significant reinvestment, the South Bronx waterfront has been developed into parks and residential buildings, and neighborhoods like Mott Haven have seen rising rents and an influx of wealthier residents. The Bronx as a whole has gentrified more slowly and more unevenly. That's good news and bad news at the same time. The bad news is that the Bronx remains the poorest urban county in the United States. The poverty that took root after the devastation of the 70s never fully lifted. The schools remain underfunded. The Cross Bronx Expressway still cuts through the borough, still exposing the 220,000 people who live near it to elevated levels of diesel exhaust, noise, and air pollution. The Bronx has the highest asthma rates of any county in New York State, and the highway that was supposed to move traffic more efficiently is still, more than 60 years later, one of the most congested roads in America. The good news is that the Bronx has held on to something that Harlem lost. The communities that survived the burning years, largely Black and Latino families who had nowhere else to go and who built something extraordinary out of nothing, are still there. The culture that emerged from the rubble, hip-hop, is still deeply embedded in those neighborhoods in ways that Harlem's Renaissance culture ultimately wasn't. The South Bronx isn't a tourist destination the way Harlem has become. It hasn't been packaged and aestheticized for outside consumption in the same way, and while that means less investment, it also means the communities there haven't been displaced to the same degree. Whether that's a victory or a failure depends entirely on what you think a neighborhood is for. Looking at the full arc of both neighborhoods, from their identical starting points in the 1890s to where they stand today, a few things become impossible to ignore. The divergence between Harlem and the Bronx wasn't inevitable. It wasn't the result of any natural process. It was the result of specific decisions made by specific people in positions of power. Robert Moses decided where to put a highway. The city of New York decided not to enforce the housing codes that would have prevented landlord abandonment. Roger Starr and the city's planning apparatus designed a policy of deliberate withdrawal from neighborhoods deemed unsalvageable. Insurance companies decided to pay out arson claims without meaningful investigation for years. And before any of that, the Federal Housing Administration, from its very first day of operations in 1934, declined to insure mortgages in low-income urban neighborhoods where the vast majority of urban Black Americans lived. While white families across the country used federally backed mortgages to buy homes, build equity, and accumulate the wealth that would define the American middle class for generations, Black families in Harlem and Latino families in the Bronx were locked out of that same mechanism by the explicit policy of the federal government. That's what historians call redlining, and its effects compounded over decades, producing the concentrated poverty that made both neighborhoods vulnerable to everything that followed. The second thing that becomes clear is that the creative explosions in both neighborhoods weren't in spite of the oppression those communities experienced. They were a response to it. When external opportunity is denied, human creativity doesn't disappear. It finds another outlet. And the third thing is the hardest to sit with. When those creative eruptions finally produced something the mainstream world decided it wanted, what the mainstream world took was the culture, not the neighborhood, not the people, just the culture. The Harlem Renaissance made Harlem famous, and then the market came for Harlem and displaced the people who made it famous. Hip-hop made the South Bronx famous, and the market is now, slowly, coming for the South Bronx. The people who created those things were, in the end, made to audition for the right to stay in the homes they had built. Harlem and the Bronx aren't anomalies. They're two of the most thoroughly documented examples of a process that has played out in cities across the United States, from the south side of Chicago to the Fifth Ward of Houston to Overtown in Miami. The process goes like this. A neighborhood fills with people who have been excluded from the desirable parts of the city. Those people build something, a community, a culture, an economy, out of what they have. The city ignores them until the neighborhood becomes too interesting or too valuable to ignore. Then the money arrives. And then the people who built the neighborhood are priced out to make room for people who can afford to pay for what they built. What Harlem and the Bronx show us, with unusual clarity, because both stories are so well documented and so embedded in American cultural memory, is that this process isn't accidental. It isn't the neutral operation of market forces. It's the result of decisions, policy decisions, planning decisions, investment decisions, decisions made by people who had power about the lives of people who didn't. The reason Harlem recovered faster than the Bronx isn't because Harlem's people were more resilient. Both communities demonstrated resilience that's almost incomprehensible. The reason is geography, the accident of location, the economics of a Manhattan address, and the reason the Bronx burned isn't because its people were less capable of maintaining a neighborhood. For decades, the Bronx was one of the most stable, tight-knit, well-maintained working-class communities in New York City. The reason the Bronx burned is because a man with unlimited power decided to put a highway through it, and nobody stopped him. Those aren't comfortable conclusions. But they're the conclusions the evidence demands. Today, if you walk through Harlem, you find two neighborhoods occupying the same streets at the same time. The brownstones renovated into multi-million-dollar townhouses, and the housing projects where families have lived for 3 generations. The artisanal coffee shops and the bodegas that have been there for 40 years. There are newcomers, many of them unaware of the history of the neighborhood they've chosen to live in, and there are old-timers watching the neighborhood change around them with a mixture of pride and grief that's difficult to articulate. If you walk through the South Bronx today, you find something different, a place that's still, visibly, in the process of becoming. The development is happening, but unevenly. The rubble lots that defined the 1970s are largely gone. And there are murals everywhere, extraordinary murals, dense with imagery and color and history, on walls and in underpasses and on the sides of bodegas, made by people who understand that this place has a story that deserves to be told. Both neighborhoods have been defined for over 100 years by forces larger than the people who lived in them. But the people who lived in them built things: music, literature, culture, community, art, that outlasted every attempt to erase them. The Harlem Renaissance gave the world Langston Hughes and Duke Ellington and Zora Neale Hurston. The South Bronx gave the world hip-hop. Whatever you think about how those gifts were received, however complicated the question of who ultimately profited from them, the gifts themselves are permanent. No highway can take them back.